Today, we are tackling one of the weirdest, most counterintuitive ideas in all of data science, the curse of dimensionality. So it all kicks off with this paradox. You'd think, right, that more information leads to better decisions. But what if I told you that in the world of AI, adding more features, more information, could actually make your model dumber? How is that even possible? Okay, let's make this real. Imagine you're building a model to predict what people will buy online. You start with the basics, right? Age, income, good start. Then you get greedy. You add their location, what they bought last week, every little item they've ever clicked on. You're thinking, this model is going to be a genius. And then, its predictions start getting worse. What gives? I mean, it feels so backward, doesn't it? More details should create a clearer picture. But this is exactly where our human intuition just completely crashes into the reality of machine learning. Because unless you have an absolutely enormous amount of data to back up every new feature you add, you're not helping. You're actually sending your model's performance right off a cliff.
And believe it or not, this isn't just some weird, random glitch. It's a known thing. It's called the Hughes phenomenon, and it describes that exact moment of betrayal. You know, when you feed your model this beautiful new feature expecting a boost, and instead, its predictive power starts to decay. It's a signal that something much, much bigger and weirder is going on underneath.
And that something bigger has a name. A really cool one, actually. The Curse of Dimensionality. This is our culprit. It's this catch-all term for all the bizarre, brain-breaking problems that pop up the second we leave our familiar 3D world and enter the strange, high-dimensional spaces where modern data actually lives. The term actually comes from this super sharp mathematician, Richard Bellman. He figured out that every time you add another variable, another dimension to your data, the volume of the space you're working in doesn't just get bigger, it explodes. It grows so ridiculously fast that things just start to break. To really wrap your head around this, let's use a simple analogy. Picture a line. That's one dimension. If you want to put down some data points to kind of cover that line, you don't need that many, right? Let's say 10 points does the trick. Pretty simple. Okay, now let's add just one more dimension. Our line becomes a square. Now, to get that same level of density, that same coverage, you don't just need 20 points. Nope, you need 10 times 10, 100 points. Suddenly, our data needs just exploded. Let's take it one more step. Into the 3D world we live in, that square becomes a cube. Now, you need 10 by 10 by 10, 1,000 points just to get the same coverage we got with 10 on a line. Think about that. We're only in 3 dimensions, and our data needs have gone through the roof. Now try to imagine a model with thousands of dimensions. And that's the absolute heart of the problem. As you add dimensions, the space grows exponentially. And unless you can find an exponential amount of data to fill it, which, let's be real, is pretty much impossible, your data points become sparse. They become these lonely, isolated little dots floating in a huge, empty void. So you've got these lonely data points. What's the big deal? Well, this is where things get really, really weird. The basic rules of geometry, the stuff that makes perfect sense to us in our 3-dimensional world, they just start to fall apart. Yeah, this quote absolutely nails it. If every single point is basically out there on its own, floating in this massive space, how in the world can a computer tell which points are close to each other? The whole idea of similarity or closeness just gets fuzzy and starts to mean nothing. And this is maybe the wildest part. Our intuition about distance just gets shattered. Here, in 3D, finding your nearest neighbor is obvious. But in, say, 3,000-dimensional space, something crazy happens. The distance from any point to its closest neighbor becomes almost identical to the distance to its farthest neighbor. Let that sink in. It means everything is, for all practical purposes, equally far away from everything else. So you might be thinking, weird geometry, who cares? Well, here's why it matters. Almost all machine learning algorithms, at their core, depend on measuring distance to find patterns and group similar things together. So if the very idea of distance becomes meaningless, the algorithms themselves break down. One huge way this breaks things is something called a combinatorial explosion. Let's say you're a scientist looking for pairs of genes that might cause a disease. Out of 2,000 genes, that's almost 4 million pairs to check. A lot, but maybe doable. But what if the cause involves 3 genes? Suddenly, you're not at a few million. You're at nearly 8 billion combinations. The problem didn't just get harder, it became functionally impossible to solve. So this all triggers a whole chain reaction of problems.
First, you get overfitting. With so much empty space, your model stops seeing the real pattern and just starts memorizing the random quirks of your training data. Then, all those extra irrelevant features just act like noise, confusing the model and leading to bad predictions. And of course, simple algorithms like k-nearest neighbors, they're totally useless because they're designed to find the nearest points. And as we saw, near doesn't really exist anymore. Let's double-click on overfitting because it's a really big one. The best analogy is a student who crams for a test by just memorizing the answer key. They'll get 100% on that one practice test, but give them a new test with slightly different questions. They're toast. They didn't actually learn anything. That's your model. It memorizes the training data perfectly, but it's completely useless on new real-world data. Okay, so right about now, you're probably thinking high dimensions are just the worst, right? A total nightmare. But here comes the twist. It turns out that this curse isn't always a curse. In some very specific, very cool situations, it's actually a blessing. No, seriously. Sometimes adding more dimensions can take a problem that's incredibly complex and make it shockingly simple to solve. They call it, you guessed it, the blessing of dimensionality. So how can it be both? Well, the curse and the blessing are really just two sides of the exact same coin. Remember how all that empty space made it hard to find neighbors? Well, that same emptiness can make it super easy to separate different classes of data. Imagine you have two tangled rings drawn on a piece of paper. You can't separate them without crossing lines. But if you lift them off the paper into the third dimension, suddenly separating them is easy. The extra dimension gave you the space you needed to find a simple solution. And that right there brings us to the key lesson. The problem was never about having too many dimensions. It was about having the wrong ones. See, a good relevant dimension adds real information. It's a signal. A useless, irrelevant dimension just adds a random noise that triggers the curse. So the real game isn't about avoiding dimensions. It's about finding the ones that truly matter. And that really is the biggest challenge we face in this age of big data, isn't it? We have access to more features, more dimensions than ever before. So our job is no longer just about collecting more and more data. It's about finding the wisdom and building the tools to sift through that endless ocean of noise to find the few signals that actually mean something.